She was 7 months pregnant, stranded at a gas station in the dead of night, when a gang of outlaws circled her car, laughing, pounding on the glass, daring her to brake. With nowhere to run and no one to call, she thought it was the end until a stranger stepped from the shadows. A scarred Marine veteran, armed with nothing but a cane, stood between her and danger. What happened next would leave an entire town whispering his name, and her child growing up with a story of survival no one could forget. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The night stretched quiet and endless across the highway, the kind of silence broken only by the hum of power lines and the faint rasp of insects hidden in the grass. Fluorescent lights buzzed over the gas station canopy, casting their cold glow on the cracked asphalt. A faded sign that once promised open 24 hours flickered weakly, struggling against the weight of years. This was not a place people lingered, only a place they passed through when the tank ran low. Claire Hartman pulled her aging sedan alongside pump number 3, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. She was 7 months pregnant, her rounded belly pushing against the steering column when she leaned forward. The drive had been long, and every bump in the road seemed to echo through her body. Her back ached from hours on the interstate, and she felt the steady reminder of fatigue pressing into her eyelids. Still, she pressed on. She had promised herself she would reach her sister's house before the week was out, no matter the miles left to travel. The pump clicked into place with a hollow sound, and Claire stepped out into the cold air. She pulled her coat tighter around her, wishing she had chosen a thicker one. Vermont nights in early autumn carried a bite that cut sharper than she remembered. The air smelled faintly of gasoline mixed with damp earth, the scent of a place that had seen better days. She glanced toward the convenience store, its windows plastered with peeling advertisements for sodas and cigarettes. Inside, a lone cashier sat behind the counter, face lit by the glow of a phone screen, disinterested in anything beyond its glass walls. Claire rested one hand on her stomach as she filled the tank, an unconscious gesture of protection. She whispered a few words under her breath, something she often did when it was just her and the child, small reassurances no one else would hear. A passing truck roared by on the highway, shaking the station with its presence before disappearing back into the night. Silence returned just as quickly, thick and unwelcoming. Her eyes drifted across the lot, taking in the emptiness. A pair of soda bottles lay tipped over near the curb. The trash can by the entrance overflowed with wrappers. Weeds grew tall along the edges of the cracked pavement. This was the kind of place where the world forgot to look, where people became invisible the moment they stepped out of their cars. She exhaled slowly, feeling that uneasy weight creep into her chest, the sensation that she was very much alone. The nozzle clicked, startling her. She slipped it back into its cradle and twisted the cap onto her tank, hands fumbling slightly. Her fingers trembled, though she told herself it was just from the cold. Sliding back into the driver's seat, she turned the key and waited for the engine to catch. It sputtered once, then again, before falling into silence. She tried again. The grinding sound was sharper this time, a mechanical refusal that sent panic rising through her chest. "Not now," she muttered, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel. She thought of the long stretch of road behind her, the hours still ahead, and the fragility of her situation. Alone, tired, and carrying a life that depended on her, she felt the walls of the night close in. She reached for her phone, but the screen flashed with only one thin bar of reception. The idea of calling for help felt almost laughable. She tried the ignition once more, coaxing the car with whispered pleas, but the engine gave nothing in return. The gas station, empty just moments ago, now felt hostile in its stillness. The buzzing lights overhead grew louder, their hum drilling into her ears. Her hand moved to her belly again, instinctively protective, as though the child could sense her unease. The night stretched out, merciless and unbroken, and Claire Hartman sat stranded beneath the glare of the canopy lights, her car dead, the highway whispering in the distance. Something in the air shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if the silence itself were waiting for something to arrive. The quiet of the lot did not last. It began as a low, distant rumble carried on the still night air, so faint at first that Claire thought it might be another semi-truck speeding down the highway. But the sound grew heavier, multiplying. the distinct thunder of motorcycle engines drawing closer with each passing second. She froze, her hand still resting on the key in the ignition, as the vibration seemed to creep beneath her skin. Headlights broke the darkness along the road, swinging into the gas station in a stagger formation. One by one, the bikes rolled under the canopy, their chrome glinting under the buzzing fluorescent lights. The noise swallowed the silence whole, the steady growl reverberating off the pavement, until it felt as though the ground itself was trembling. Claire's pulse quickened. She knew instinctively that this was no passing group, simply stopping for fuel. There was a casual menace in the way they circled in, taking up space with deliberate ease, as if they had just claimed the station as their own. She counted them without meaning to, 5, then 6, then 7. Men in leather vests patched with symbols she did not recognize. Their hair long, faces unshaven, expressions hidden behind the shadows of helmets and a hard set of jaws. They did not park in neat rows but scattered themselves across the lot, engines idling loud and uneven. A few swung off their bikes with heavy boots striking the asphalt, the metallic rattle of chains and buckles punctuating each movement. Claire's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, pressing protectively against the swell beneath her coat. She lowered her head slightly, praying they would pay her no mind, that she was just another traveler they would ignore. But her car, dead and useless, betrayed her. She could not leave, could not disappear into the safety of motion. She was stuck beneath the artificial light, exposed. One of the bikers, a tall figure with greasy blonde hair spilling from under his helmet, smirked as his gaze fell on her. He nudged a man beside him, pointing in her direction. Their laughter carried across the lot, sharp and ugly, rising above the restless rumble of engines. A third man flicked a cigarette butt onto the ground, sparks scattering across the concrete as his eyes locked on the solitary woman at pump 3. They moved slowly, not rushing, savoring the moment. Two leaned against their bikes, watching, while another began to walk in her direction with a swaggering gait. The way they spread out felt intentional, closing gaps, filling the lot with their presence. It was a kind of hunting posture, predators circling prey that had no chance of running. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, but the single bar of reception glared back at her uselessly. She looked toward the convenience store. The cashier inside was gone from the counter, the space behind the glass now empty. Whether he had stepped into the back room or had deliberately chosen to disappear, she could not know. What she did know was that there would be no help coming from there. The first outlaw reached the edge of her car, leaning down to peer through the driver's side window. His grin was wide, his teeth bared in something between amusement and threat. He tapped on the glass with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the stillness between engines. Another joined him, circling to the passenger side, rapping his knuckles against the metal of the door as if testing its strength. Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Her baby shifted inside her, a reminder that every choice she made now was not just for herself. She whispered, "Please, please just go," though no one could hear her. The bikers' laughter rolled across the lot, mocking and cruel, the sound of men who had found something to entertain them in the middle of a quiet night. The gas station lights flickered once, and for a moment the entire place seemed to teeter between shadow and glare, as though the night itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The laughter began low, a rough chorus carried on the smoke-filled air, but it grew bolder as the men drew closer. Claire sat frozen behind the wheel, her breath fogging the glass in short bursts. Every instinct told her to keep still, to remain invisible, but the harder she tried not to notice them, the more she felt their eyes pressing against her. The sound of boots dragging across asphalt echoed in uneven rhythm, circling the car. It was a slow, measured pace of people who knew they had nowhere else to be, who enjoyed the fear that silence left behind. The first voice broke through the growl of engines, still idling across the lot. "Hey there, sweetheart," one of them called, his words dripping with mockery rather than charm. "Out awful late to be shopping for diapers, ain't ya?" The others howled, the laughter coarse, striking her like stones against glass. Another voice added, "Maybe she's just looking for company. Looks lonely sitting there all by herself." Claire's stomach tightened, her hand instinctively pressing against the swell beneath her coat. The child shifted inside her, and she held her breath, terrified that any sound, even the softest movement, would draw more attention. She tried to fix her eyes on the dashboard, but their reflections shifted in the side mirror, shadows looming larger as they leaned closer. One of them tapped the back of her car with the edge of his boot, the dull thud jolting through the frame. Another rapped his knuckles on glass again, louder this time. "Come on, Mama, open up. We just want to talk," he sneered. The word stretched out too long. Every syllable meant a taunt. She kept her head down, gripping the wheel until her knuckles ached, but her silence only seemed to amuse them more. The circle tightened. A pair of them leaned against the hood, their weight pressing the suspension downward with a faint groan. One crouched near the passenger side mirror, grinning up at her as though he could read her thoughts. "Look at her. She's shaken," he said, and their laughter swelled again. The sound was different this time, less playful, more deliberate, carrying an edge that made her pulse quicken. Claire thought of her phone, lying useless on the seat beside her. She thought of turning the key again, though she knew the engine would only groan in betrayal. Panic crawled up her throat, threatening to choke her. The world outside had shrunk to the harsh pool of light under the canopy, the engines idling at the edges like a warning that there was no escape. Her heart raced so hard, she could feel it in her temples. The air inside the car seemed thin, each breath harder to draw than the last. The bikers knew it, too. They moved with the confidence of men who had seen fear before and recognized its weight. One of them spat on the pavement, the wet sound sharp against the steady hum of motorcycles. Another dragged a finger slowly along the glass, tracing the curve of her window like he was marking territory. She whispered a prayer, barely audible, though her lips moved as though repeating a ritual of survival. She wanted to be anywhere but here, back on the road, back in the comfort of motion. But the car remained dead, her sanctuary nothing more than a fragile shell. The laughter returned, mocking, circling, pushing deeper into her sense of isolation. The way they leaned and shifted was not random. It was a practiced rhythm of men who understood how to corner something defenseless. Predators in no hurry, savoring the moment, knowing she could not leave. Claire's hand shook on the wheel, her stomach twisted in fear, and still she kept her eyes forward, hoping that if she did not respond, they might tire of the game. But their voices carried on louder now, crueler. "Bet the kid's gonna come out kicking, just like Mama," one jeered. Another added, "Hope it ain't scared already. Looks like Mama is." Their laughter hitched again, rolling across the lot, sealing her in with the cold certainty that she had become the night's entertainment. For the first time, Claire felt the sharp realization that no one was coming from the store, no headlights turned in from the road, no witnesses stirred. It was her, the men, and the vast, indifferent silence of the highway. Claire twisted the key again, her hand trembling as the ignition gave nothing but a hollow click. She tried once more, pumping the pedal as if pleading with the car to respond, but all she heard was the dull grind of machinery that had given up on her. The sound cut through the night, like a cruel reminder that she was not going anywhere. Her chest tightened as she sat back, pressing the heel of her hand against the steering wheel, willing herself not to panic. The gas station lights above flickered, their constant buzz drilling into her skull, a reminder of how exposed she was beneath their harsh glare. The car had been coughing through the trip, threatening at every stoplight to stall, but she had begged it silently to last a little longer, just long enough to get her to her sister's house. She had whispered promises into the steering wheel. Just one more mile, just one more town. Now it had chosen this place to die. A forgotten gas station on the edge of nowhere, under lights that made her feel like a moth pinned to a display board. Her reflection in the window looked back at her, pale and drawn. She touched her stomach, the firm swell beneath her coat, and tried to steady her breathing. The baby shifted again, as if sensing her distress, and she whispered softly, "It's okay. We'll be okay." Her words dissolved into the hum of the fluorescent bulbs, swallowed by the emptiness around her. Outside, the motorcycles still idled. Their riders lingered near the pumps, not fueling, not leaving, just loitering with a kind of intent that chilled her blood. The scent of gasoline hung heavy in the air, sharp and dizzying. She glanced at the convenience store, but the glass storefront reflected only the glare of lights. No movement inside, no cashier to step in and break the tension. The parking lot stretched flat and bare around her. Nowhere to hide. No other cars to blend into. No passing trucks to shield her. She turned the key again, desperation tightening her jaw, but the engine stayed silent. The hopelessness of the sound sank into her bones. She tried the door lock, checking it twice, 3 times, as though the small piece of metal between her and them could change everything. Her hands shook as she checked her phone, but the single bar of reception mocked her. She could dial, but she doubted anyone would hear her voice clearly enough to matter. The bikers hadn't noticed her struggle. She could see them watching in the mirrors, grins spreading, shoulders nudging each other as they exchanged words she could not hear. The laughter started again, carried on the cold air, sharper than before. One of them kicked at the base of a pump, the clang echoing through the empty lot. Another revved his engine, the roar so close that her car vibrated in its frame. The noise settled into her chest like thunder that refused to pass. Claire pressed herself back into the seat, gripping the wheel though it offered no safety. Every angle of light made her visible, her silhouette clear from every direction. She realized then how trapped she was. No escape forward, no safe retreat. Even the road, stretching out black and endless, offered no promise if she couldn't move the car. She imagined stepping out, imagined the concrete under her shoes. But the thought froze her. Out there, under those lights, she would not just be stranded. She would be vulnerable in a way that terrified her more than the dead engine. The baby shifted again, and she tried to focus on that small life, that heartbeat she carried with her. She had left so much behind protected, fought through exhaustion and loneliness, and now here she was, cornered between pumps in a place where the night felt like it belonged to someone else. She whispered another promise to her child. Her voice steady though her hands trembled. "We'll make it. Somehow, we'll make it." But even as she spoke, she could feel the circle tightening outside, shadows moving in and laughter spilling closer. Her car was no longer a vehicle. It was a cage lit up for everyone to see, and she was the unwilling centerpiece beneath the buzzing lights. The first knock came like a gunshot against the glass. Claire jumped, her breath catching in her throat, the sound ringing far louder than it should have in the hollow stillness of the lot. She turned her head slowly, afraid of what she might see, and found one of the bikers leaning over her window. His face was half hidden by greasy hair and a scruff of beard, his grin crooked and wide. He tapped again, harder this time, the sharp rap of knuckles echoing across the metal shell of her car. "Come on, sweetheart," he drawled, his voice muffled through the glass. "Don't play shy now." His words were followed by a laugh that spread quickly to the others, a ripple of ugly sound that carried on the cool night air. Another figure moved in from the passenger side, pounding on the door with the flat of his hand, the metal vibrating under the blow. Claire gasped, instinctively locking the doors again, though she knew she had already done it. Her fingers fumbled on the knob, turning it twice, 3 times, her heart racing with the pointless reassurance. The circle tightened. 2 leaned against the hood, their boots scraping the paint as they settled in like men claiming ownership of a space that wasn't theirs. Another crouched low, peering into the passenger window with a smile that was more leer than kindness. He cupped his hands around his eyes, fogging the glass as he tried to see inside. "Look at her," he called out, his tone mocking, shaking like a leaf. "Don't worry, Mama. We'll take good care of you." The laughter returned, louder now, echoing off the gas pumps and the walls of the empty store. One of them smacked the trunk with an open hand, the hollow clang reverberating through the frame. Another leaned down, dragging a coin along the glass in slow, deliberate scratches. The screeching sound set Claire's teeth on edge, her stomach twisting as though her body itself recoiled. She tried the ignition again, desperate for the engine to spark, but all she heard was the same grinding refusal. The sound betrayed her weakness, and the bikers roared with laughter at her failed attempt. One of them slammed a palm against the roof, the impact jolting her in her seat. The car rocked slightly under force, and she gripped the steering wheel harder, her knuckles white, her breathing quickened. She tried not to cry, not to let them see her break, but tears threatened anyway, pooling hot at the corners of her eyes. She pressed her lips together, whispering silent prayers, promises, anything that might keep her steady. The baby shifted again inside her, a small kick that brought a rush of panic and protectiveness all at once. She placed her hand over her stomach, whispering, "It's okay. Stay calm. Please." The man at her window rapped his knuckles once more, this time curling his fingers as if testing the strength of the glass. He leaned close, so close she could see the lines etched into his weathered skin, the scars across his cheek. "Ain't polite to ignore folks trying to talk to you," he sneered. His breath fogged the glass, leaving a faint smear that caught the fluorescent light. The others cheered him on, shouting crude remarks, daring each other to make her flinch, daring her to open the door. The night had turned into a stage, and she was the unwilling performance under their jeering spotlight. The buzzing lights above flickered again, casting shadows that stretched and twisted across the lot, making the men seem larger, more monstrous than they already were. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, her body shaking as she tried to imagine herself anywhere else. On the open road, in the safety of her sister's home, surrounded by walls that locked out the world. But when she opened her eyes again, she saw only the grinning faces pressed against her glass, the hands slapping her car, the bodies crowding closer. They had stopped being content to laugh from a distance. Now they pressed in fully, daring her to open the door, daring her to break under the pressure. And with every knock, every scrape, every cruel word, the walls of her fragile refuge felt thinner, as though the night itself was closing in, urging her surrender. From the shadowed porch of the convenience store, a figure lingered where the buzzing lights did not reach. He stood just beyond the glow of the canopy, half hidden by the columns that framed the store's tired facade. To anyone glancing in his direction, he might have looked like nothing more than a customer taking his time, someone smoking a cigarette or waiting for a ride. But Daniel Rourke was not waiting. He was watching. The hum of motorcycles carried across the lot, punctuated by bursts of laughter sharp enough to slice through the night. His eyes, pale and steady, never left the woman trapped in her car. He could see her flinch with every slam of fist against the glass, the way her hands pressed over her stomach in instinctive protection. The bikers had surrounded her like wolves, careless of the lights above or the fact that their cruelty had turned the gas station into their stage. Daniel's jaw tightened, the lines in his weathered face deepening. He had seen this posture before, men circling the weak, taunting for sport, convinced that numbers gave him power. His coat was worn at the edges, the faded fabric a dull brown that had once been military issue but had since lost its sharpness. His boots bore the marks of miles walked across terrain that most men would never know, and his right hand rested lightly on the carved handle of a cane that looked less like support and more like a weapon disguised in plain sight. The faint scar that ran across his cheek caught the dim light each time he shifted, a reminder of battles fought far from here, in deserts and alleys where the enemy never announced itself until it was too late. He exhaled slowly, his breath a white cloud in the cold night air. He had not come here looking for trouble. The road had brought him past the gas station, and habit made him pause at the porch, scanning like he always did. Years in the Marines had left him with a discipline he could never quite set down. He noticed things others didn't, the angle of bodies, the tone of laughter, the shift in weight that signaled intent. What he saw unfolding before him was familiar in ways that made his stomach knot with memory. He had been in places where civilians were caught in the wrong corner at the wrong time, where a handful of armed men thought themselves untouchable. Those memories had followed him home, woven into the scar tissue of his mind. The woman was terrified. He could see it in the way her shoulders hunched, in the way her face turned just enough to avoid looking at the men directly. He knew the kind of fear that made every second stretch longer, the kind that left a person convinced no one would intervene. His hand tightened on the cane. He did not rush forward. Not yet. He had learned long ago that timing mattered. A sudden move too soon might escalate what was already turning dangerous. But the thought of doing nothing gnawed at him. He had done nothing once, long ago, when a choice to act had been tangled up with orders that told him to wait. That night had cost a man his life, and had left Daniel with a weight he had carried across continents and years. The bikers grew louder, emboldened by her silence, striking the car harder, circling tighter. Daniel's eyes narrowed. His pulse remained steady, his breathing controlled. The weight had been drilled into him until it was second nature. He did not hear the laughter as others might. He heard the rhythms of aggression, the escalation toward a breaking point. Every instinct told him that moment was seconds away. He shifted his stance, pushing away from the shadowed post that had concealed him. The cane tapped lightly against the wood as he stepped forward, a measured sound that belonged more to ritual than necessity. His gaze never wavered from the woman's car. She was alone, stranded, and though the world might pass by indifferent, Daniel Rourke would not. Not tonight. The lights above the gas station hummed their endless tune, but Daniel Rourke stood still, a figure carved out of shadow and silence. He looked as though he had stepped out of another time, his presence not fitting the mundane setting of flickering bulbs and cracked pavement. His jacket hung loosely on his frame, its faded brown fabric patched in places where years were frayed the seams. Once, long ago, it had been issued to him in a desert half a world away, its fabric meant to endure sandstorms and long nights under a foreign sky. Now it bore the stains of gasoline, dirt, and time. His hands, resting lightly on the carved wood of his cane, told a story of their own. The skin was rough, knuckles thickened, calluses carved into them as permanent as bone. A deep scar ran across his right palm, pale against the weathered tan of his skin, the kind of wound that could only have come from steel or fire. His fingers curled with a quiet strength, steady even in stillness. They were hands that had once steadied rifles, patched tourniquets in the dark, and carried men heavier than himself across terrain that broke lesser bodies. They had not forgotten their purpose, even if the years had changed a man who carried them. A faint scar traced his cheek, an uneven line just beneath the eye, too deliberate to be anything but the mark of survival. Under the harsh glow of the gas station, it caught the light in quick flashes whenever he shifted. To those who might notice, it was unsettling, an unspoken message that this was a man who had walked through violence and returned with his memory etched into his skin. His hair was peppered with gray at the temples, cropped short more out of habit than care, and his jaw remained firm, though the years had left lines carved deep into his face. He had the look of someone who had seen more nights like this than he would ever admit, but it was his posture that set him apart from the noise around him. He stood in stillness, not stiff but deliberate, shoulders squared, feet planted as though even the ground beneath him was not to be trusted. Every movement was controlled, economical, born from training that had been drilled into him until it was second nature. To the casual eye, he looked like a man leaning quietly on a cane, but to anyone who had seen battle, his stance spoke of readiness. His gaze swept the lot, calculating distance, exits, angles of approach. He had been taught to read terrain not as scenery, but as strategy, and it was a habit that had never left him. The bikers laughed louder now, emboldened by their numbers and the helpless figure inside the car. But Daniel's face did not shift. His eyes, pale blue, almost watercolor, remained locked on the scene. There was no visible anger, no tremor of hesitation. Instead, there was the cold discipline of a man who had been forced to hold his fire until the right moment, who had learned that patience could mean the difference between saving lives and losing them. The discipline was not a choice. It was survival, carved into him long before this night. The cane tapped softly once against the wooden porch as he shifted his weight, the sound almost drowned by the roar of engines. It was an old piece of oak, its surface smooth where his hand had rested countless times, the base worn flat from miles walked. To others it was a tool of support, but in his grip it carried another story. The balance of it, the way his fingers wrapped around the carved handle, suggested it could serve another purpose if called upon. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath clouding in the cold air. He did not rush, did not allow emotion to dictate the moment. He knew better. He had been called many things over the years: soldier, protector, killer, survivor. But tonight, he was something else. He was a shadow across the road, the ghost that Ward left behind. And though his battles were supposed to have ended long ago, his body and his silence spoke of a truth he had never escaped. As the men outside the woman's car shouted and pounded on the glass, Daniel's hand tightened on the cane. He did not flinch at their noise. He had heard worse, in places where laughter meant ambush and every shadow hid an enemy. The gas station might have been just another stop for anyone else, but for him it had become a field again, a place where chaos threatened the innocent, and ghosts like him did not turn away when the fight came to their doorstep. The laughter around Claire's car rose in harsh bursts, bouncing off the concrete and the metal of the pumps, swelling until it seemed the whole lot was filled with their noise. Hands slapped against her windows. Knuckles drummed against the doors. Boots scraped against the hood. They were daring her to move, daring her to cry, daring her to give them some sign that their attention had broken her. She pressed herself tighter into the seat, her palms clammy against the steering wheel, praying for the world to intervene. And then, quietly at first, the rhythm of the lot changed. A sound almost too soft to notice cut through the noise. The steady tap of wood against asphalt. It carried with it a strange weight, not loud but deliberate, a sound that demanded attention even without raising its voice. The bikers were too caught in their game to hear it first, but Claire did. Her eyes darted to the side mirror, catching movement from across the road. A figure stepped out from the shadows of a convenience store porch, his outline sharp under the harsh glow of the buzzing lights. Daniel Rourke moved without hurry, each step measured, his cane striking the ground in a rhythm that seemed to echo louder with every second. He wasn't young, and his body carried the evidence of years that had shaped him, but there was no fragility in his approach. His shoulders were squared, his posture disciplined, and though the bikers outnumbered him many times over, something about the way he crossed that stretch of pavement made the jeers falter. The men noticed him now, one by one. Their eyes turned from the terrified woman in the car to the stranger approaching with unnerving calm. "What's this?" one muttered, his grin faltering just slightly. Another barked a laugh, though it came out sharper than he intended, forced against a rising tension he couldn't quite ignore. The engines idled behind them, their steady growl blending with the quiet, steady tap of wood on concrete. Daniel did not quicken his pace. He moved as though time itself belonged to him, as though the outcome was already decided. His cane touched down with certainty, his boots falling silently between. He carried no weapon beyond what was in his hand, but his presence alone shifted the air. The bikers straightened, exchanging glances at masked unease with bravado. Men who had been moments away from forcing open a door now found themselves stepping back without realizing it. Claire watched, her breath catching as the figure drew closer. She didn't know who he was, didn't know why he was there, but something in his manner stilled her panic. He wasn't rushing in like a fool, wasn't shouting for them to stop. He was simply walking, and somehow that walk cut sharper than any raised voice could. The leader of the group, tall and broad with a patchy beard, stepped forward, forcing a smirk onto his face. "Evening, old man," he called, his tone mocking, though his eyes flickered with a brief hesitation. "You lost something? This ain't your business." Daniel stopped just a few paces from the circle, the cane planted firmly between him and the man. He lifted his gaze, steady and unflinching, and though he said nothing at first, the silence pressed heavier than their laughter had moments before. It was the silence of a man who had stood in worse places, faced worse odds, and survived them all. One of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath. Another forced a laugh that didn't carry far. The leader spat on the ground, trying to fill the void with sound. But Daniel remained still, his pale eyes fixed, his presence undeniable. He had not yet spoken, but already the night belonged less to the outlaws than it had before. The buzzing lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the woman in the car, the men around her, and the quiet stranger who had stepped from the dark all seemed suspended in that moment, waiting to see which way the night would turn. The silence stretched between them, heavy and strange, broken only by the steady hum of idling engines and the faint buzz of the lights above. Daniel Rourke stood in the center of it, his cane planted firmly on the cracked asphalt, his posture steady. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even said a word, yet his calmness seemed to hang in the air like a challenge no one wanted to meet directly. The bikers shifted uneasily at first, their laughter tapering into low murmurs, until one of them, narrow-eyed and restless, forced the mood back into mockery. "What's this?" he sneered, looking Daniel up and down. "Somebody's grandpa wandered off the porch?" His voice was loud, meant more for the group than for the man who stood before him. The others chuckled, encouraged by the remark, though the sound had a strained edge. One of them slapped his knee dramatically, pointing at the cane. "Look at that stick. Careful, boys, don't scare him. Might throw out a hip." Their laughter rose again, harsh and forced, an attempt to drown the stillness Daniel carried with him. Daniel didn't move. His grip on the cane never shifted, His pale eyes never wavered. He stood as if rooted, as if the noise around him were only wind across a barren field. The quiet strength in his lack of reaction unsettled them more than any outburst might have. It forced them to fill the space with louder jokes, each one thrown out like stones that fell short of their target. The leader, taller than the rest, with a patchy beard and the air of someone used to being the loudest voice in the room, stepped forward. He tilted his head, studying Daniel with narrowed eyes. "You look like you've seen better days, old man," he said, voice low but sharp. "World's moved on. You're standing there like you matter, but I see what you are. Broken, washed up, leftovers from somebody else's fight." The words hung in the air, ugly in their precision, designed to sting. The others echoed them with snickers, leaning into the insult. "Washed up," one repeated. "Yeah, sitting on the porch waiting for somebody to pour his soup." Another added, "Probably talks to himself about the good old days, back when anybody cared who he was." Daniel's face remained unreadable. He neither denied nor confirmed their accusations. He didn't flinch at the word broken, though his hands bore the scars of battles fought long ago. He didn't bristle at being called washed up, though the lines on his face spoke of years carved hard by survival. He let the words pass, as though they had no weight, as though they couldn't touch him. That silence unnerved them more than they wanted to admit. Insults usually provoke reaction, anger, defensiveness, anything to prove their taunt had power. But Daniel gave them nothing. His stillness forced them to confront their own noise, their own need to prove dominance. The mocking laughter faltered, scattered into uneven chuckles that didn't quite hold together. The leader spat onto the asphalt, masking unease with disdain. "You don't scare us, old man," he muttered, though the defiance in his tone didn't ring as true as he wanted it to. Daniel finally shifted his weight slightly, the cane tapping once against the ground, a quiet punctuation that carried further than their jeers. He still hadn't spoken, but the sound was enough to cut through the noise, to remind them that silence could be heavier than words. His eyes swept across them, calm and steady, as if measuring not the men they thought they were, but the choices they would soon be forced to make. For Claire, still trapped in her car, the exchange was almost surreal. She could hear the mocking words, the cruel laughter, but her focus was fixed on the stranger's composure. He stood alone against them, yet somehow he didn't seem outnumbered. His calmness unsettled even her, not because it frightened her, but because it felt unshakable, as if he had stepped into the lot carrying the weight of something larger than himself. The bikers sensed it too, though they buried their unease beneath more jokes, louder voices, harsher laughter. Still, the man's silence pressed against them, reminding them that not every battle was fought with noise. Some were fought with the quiet certainty of a man who had already lived through worse and returned standing. Daniel stood motionless for a long moment, letting their laughter burn itself out, letting the taunts echo across the lot until even the bikers seemed tired of hearing themselves. He had seen this pattern before in alleys and marketplaces far from home, men puffing themselves up, mistaking noise for power. He knew the rhythm of it, the false bravado that built itself into a frenzy before shattering when tested. He had spent most of his life in places where restraint was harder than violence, where holding the line meant waiting until the last possible second. And here, under the buzz of flickering lights, with a terrified woman watching from behind the glass of her car, he called on that patience again. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, and carried none of the tension of the moment. "That's enough." Just 2 words, but they cut through the night like a blade. He didn't raise his voice, didn't bark it like command, yet it carried a finality that stilled the laughter more effectively than any shout could have. The leader turned his head, squinting at him, trying to gauge whether to treat the words as a challenge or as background noise. "Enough?" he repeated, chuckling without mirth. "You stroll in here with your cane and your stare, and you think you get to tell us when it's enough?" He spat to the side, his smirk curling into something sharper. "This ain't your business." Daniel's eyes didn't shift. He took 1 step forward, the cane striking the pavement with that same measured tap. His shoulders stayed square, his posture controlled. "It's my business now," he said simply. The words were neither boast nor threat, but they landed with the weight of a man who never wasted language. One of the bikers jeered, his voice louder than the others, a mask for his unease. "What's the plan, old man? Gonna wave that stick at us? You can barely stand straight." He laughed, but the sound faltered when Daniel turned his gaze on him. Pale eyes steady, unreadable. "You've got one chance," Daniel said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Walk away." He didn't flinch, didn't waver. The sentence hung in the air, simple and immovable, as if it were less a warning than a fact already decided. The leader barked another laugh, louder this time, forcing it out to reassure his men. "Or what? You'll break a hip trying to stop us?" He stepped closer, closing the gap, towering over the veteran as if size alone could crush the moment. But even in the shadow of the man's frame, Daniel did not move. He let the silence hang again, let the words sink into them. Claire watched from the car, her breath caught in her chest. She could hear the steadiness in his voice, the way it didn't rise or fall. It was a kind of tone that carried conviction without volume, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had faced death before and no longer feared it. For the first time since the bikers had cornered her, she felt a flicker of hope, as though the presence of the stranger had shifted the balance in a way she couldn't explain. The bikers muttered among themselves, shoving at one another, their bravado stretched thin. They weren't used to warnings delivered without bluster. They weren't used to someone who didn't match their noise with more noise. Daniel's calmness unsettled them, made them second-guess what kind of man stood before them. He tapped the cane once against the ground, a sound that echoed louder than it should have. "I won't say it again," he said, quiet but final. "Walk away while you can." The leader smirked, but there was a hesitation in the way he shifted his weight, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He covered it with another laugh, with more insults muttered under his breath. Yet the seed had been planted. The warning had been given, sharp and undeniable. Whether they heeded it or not would be their choice. But the man who had given it left no doubt about what would follow if they didn't. The moment stretched taut, a line drawn invisible across the cracked pavement of the lot. Daniel stood his ground, his cane firm in the space between himself and the men who jeered, while the outlaw leader smirked with a kind of arrogance born from never having been tested by something greater than himself. The man's shoulders were broad beneath his leather vest, his boots heavy as they scraped against the asphalt. He stepped closer, chest puffed, eyes narrowing in challenge, the smirk deepening into something uglier. "Well, look at you," he said, voice dripping mockery. "Standing, here like you're going to scare somebody. You think we're afraid of a limp and a stick?" His laughter spilled out, and the others followed, though not as convincingly as before. The tension in the air was too sharp, too obvious. Daniel didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed, calm, steady. The silence unnerved them more than the words might have. But the leader pressed on, unwilling to let that stillness hold power over him. He lifted his boot and brought it down sharply against the cane, shoving it aside with deliberate force. The wood clattered against the pavement for an instant before Daniel steadied again, his grip never fully loosening. The laughter erupted instantly, loud and wild, filling the night like a roar. The men slapped each other's shoulders, their voices bouncing off the pumps and glass storefront, mocking the sight of the veteran forced to adjust. The leader leaned in close, his breath hot in the cool air, his grin wide. "What's the matter, old man? Can't keep your stick upright?" Claire gasped from inside the car, her heart pounding at the sight. She had hoped, even prayed, that the man's calm would be enough to keep the bikers from going further. But now the boundary had been crossed. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, useless though it was, her other hand resting over her belly as though she could shield the child within her from what was coming. Daniel's expression didn't change. He righted the cane with slow precision, the wood tapping softly as it found its balance again. His grip was sure, his shoulders still square. He did not rise to their bait, did not let anger twist his face. Instead, his calm deepened, a quietness that seemed at odds with the jeering noise around him. The leader didn't like it. He had expected outrage, a shove, a crack in the man's composure. Instead, he found himself staring into eyes that refused to yield, pale and unblinking, eyes that had seen worse than anything he could imagine. The laughter of his men faltered, just slightly, when Daniel failed to give them the reaction they craved. "You don't belong here," the leader said, his tone harder now. forcing dominance where doubt had begun to creep in. He shoved at the cane again, though this time with less force, his hand brushing against the smooth wood. "This ain't your fight. Walk away while you still can." Daniel tilted his head, the faintest gesture, and spoke for the first time since the shove. His voice was low, even unshaken. "Last chance," he said, the words carrying not threat but certainty. The laughter broke again, louder, harsher, as if to drown out the weight of what had just been spoken. The men shouted and jeered, their bravado rushing to cover the unease none of them wanted to name. But underneath their noise, something had shifted. The cane had been shoved, the line tested. Daniel Rourke had not moved back. He had not broken, and that quiet defiance unsettled them more than they dared to admit. Claire watched with wide eyes, the flickering lights above painting the scene in harsh contrasts. The mocking voices filled the lot, but her focus stayed on the man who stood steady, unbent by insult or force. Something told her the night was building toward a breaking point, and when it came, there would be no more room for laughter. The shove had left the air electric, the kind of moment where laughter clung too tightly to the night, forced and brittle. The bikers roared their leader's boldness, their voices echoing through the empty lot, filling the silence with bravado. They thought the veteran had been humiliated, thought the cane was just a crutch and the man behind it nothing more than a relic holding himself upright. Their laughter carried the certainty that they had won without ever throwing a punch. Daniel did not laugh. He did not shout. He did not even shift his stance as the noise rose around him. Instead, he waited, his eyes scanning, measuring. Years of training had honed him into someone who could recognize the instant when talk turned to violence, when the predator lunged and the prey's window to act narrowed to nothing. And in that breathless span of time, he saw one of the bikers step too close, his hand brushing against the handle of a knife strapped to his belt, his mouth twisted into a smirk that promised more than words. Daniel moved. The strike came with a speed and precision that defied the weight of his years. His cane snapped upward, not in a wild swing, but in a sharp, controlled arc that struck clean across the man's temple. The sound of wood-meeting bone cracked through the lot, sharp as breaking glass. The biker's eyes went wide. His smirk froze in half-form before his legs gave way beneath him. He collapsed onto the asphalt, his body sprawling limp, the laughter around him cut short into stunned silence. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the dull clatter of the man's chain rattling against the pavement as his body twitched, then stilled. The rest of the group stared, their mouths open, caught between disbelief and rage. What had looked like weakness seconds earlier had revealed itself as something far more dangerous. Claire's breath caught in her throat. From inside the car, she had seen the blur of motion. Too fast a process, too exact a mistake, as clumsy. She pressed her hand to the glass, her heart hammering as a man who had stood so still a moment ago revealed just how much strength lay hidden behind that silence. The leader's face twisted, his smirk gone, replaced by the tight jaw of a man realizing he had underestimated his opponent. "You son of a," he snarled. His words cut short by the sudden tension gripping the rest of his crew. The bikers shuffled, some taking involuntary steps backward, others clenching fists around chains or bottles they had carried with them. Their jeers had evaporated, leaving only anger and uncertainty. They had thought they were circling easy prey. Now they were circling a man who had just dropped one of their own without a wasted movement. Daniel adjusted his grip on the cane, his posture never breaking. He didn't taunt them, didn't boast about what he had done. His eyes remained steady, cold, calculating, as though the strike had been less an act of violence than a line drawn in sand. His breathing stayed even, his stance grounded. He looked less like a man who had lashed out and more like someone who had delivered a message. This was not the fight they thought it was. One of the younger bikers cursed under his breath, the sound shaky despite the attempted defiance. Another glance at the leader as if waiting for instruction, as though the chain of command they lived by suddenly felt fragile. The leader growled, stepping forward, his boots heavy on the concrete. He bent down, checking the man on the ground, who groaned faintly but did not rise. Straightening, his glare fixed on Daniel. "Big mistake," he spat, his voice low and dark. "You don't get to touch one of mine and walk away." But Daniel said nothing. His silence pressed heavier than their noise of moments ago, the weight of it unsettling, unshakable. The first strike had been made. The balance of power had shifted, and though the outlaws still outnumbered him, none of them could deny the truth that now stood before them. The man they mocked as broken had revealed himself as something far different. A soldier, even here, even now, a ghost of war who still knew exactly how to fight. The moment after the first man fell was like a crack in the night. Silence shattered into chaos, as if the strike had broken something more than bone. The bikers surged forward, their outrage filling the lot with a roar that drowned out the idling engines. Boots pounded the pavement. Curses spat through clenched teeth, fists swinging wildly in a storm of violence that no longer had direction. Daniel moved with the precision of someone who had lived inside chaos before, who understood that survival wasn't about strength but about control. His cane swept out again, low and fast, catching another biker across the shins. The man toppled, crashing into the base of a fuel pump with a sickening thud. The heavy metal structure shuddered, the nozzle slipping from its holster and dangling, gasoline spattering onto the concrete below. The sharp stench of fuel instantly filled the air, stinging Claire's nose even to the glass of her car. She gasped, clutching her stomach with both hands, her eyes darting to the pump as though the liquid itself were a fuse waiting for fire. The thought of sparks, of engines revving too close, sent cold panic through her. But she couldn't move, couldn't intervene. She was trapped in her seat, while the world around her seemed to tilt toward disaster. The men didn't notice the danger at first. Their rage eclipsed everything. One swung a chain, the metal links whistling through the air. Daniel pivoted, letting it skim past his shoulder, then stepped into the opening. His cane jabbed hard into the biker's ribs. The sound of breath forced violently from lungs cutting through the night. The man staggered back, colliding with another who had been charging in, and together they stumbled into the glass front of the convenience store. The impact sent a cascade of bottles toppling from their shelves inside. The crash of shattering glass rang out, followed by the sharp hiss of carbonated soda, spraying in every direction. Neon-colored liquid streamed across the linoleum floor, mixing with shards of glass that glittered under the weak store lights. The cashier, who had vanished earlier, shouted something from the back but never reappeared. The store became nothing more than another casualty of the brawl outside. Back in the lot, another biker lunged with a knife drawn from his belt, the blade catching the light as he slashed toward Daniel. The veteran sidestepped, his cane snapping upward with deadly precision. The wood cracked against the biker's wrist, sending the knife clattering onto the pavement. It skittered across the lot and came to rest near Claire's car tire, the steel glinting ominously just inches from where she sat frozen. Engines roared as two of the motorcycles were kicked over in a fray, their frames crashing onto the ground with metallic screeches. Gasoline leaked from one of the tanks, joining the spreading puddle beneath the pumps. The acrid smell thickened, suffocating, mingling with the sting of smoke from a lit cigarette that one biker dropped in confusion. He stomped it out quickly, more from reflex and caution, but the sight of flame near fuel made Claire's pulse spike until she thought she might faint. Daniel's movement stayed sharp, his body turning with every strike, every deflection. He didn't waste energy, didn't lash out blindly. To him, the chaos was just another battlefield, another storm to navigate. He had been here before, in alleys where fire rained from rooftops, in markets where crowds screamed as men with rifles tore through. This gas station, for all its flickering lights and cracked concrete, was no different. He knew what to do. One of the bikers, furious and desperate, grabbed a loose glass bottle from the ground and hurled it at Daniel's head. Daniel ducked, the bottle sailing past him and exploding against the concrete wall of the store. Shards flew outward, glittering in the harsh light, slicing into the arm of another man who howled in pain. The chaos turned inward for a moment, their fury scattering in confusion as they collided with one another. Claire pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, whispering frantic prayers through the tears streaking her face. Every crash, every shout, every shattering of glass rattled through her body as though the baby inside her could feel it too. She felt the child shift, restless, as if responding to the violence outside. The lot smelled of gasoline and fear, sharp and raw. Every sound was magnified, every movement sharpened by the threat of fire and ruin. The bikers had thought they controlled the night. But the moment one of their own hit the pavement, control had slipped from their hands. Now they stumbled, swung, shouted, and destroyed everything around them, their rage unraveling into chaos. And in the center of it all, Daniel Rourke stood steady, a single figure of discipline cutting through the storm. The gas station lot reeked of gasoline, the air heavy with a sharp tang that clung to the back of the throat. Shards of glass sparkled across the pavement, catching the harsh light of the buzzing canopy. Engines still idled unevenly, their guttural rumble a reminder of the chaos that had just erupted. But through it all, Daniel Rourke moved with steady precision that cut against the frenzy. He shifted his stance. Kane angled slightly, his body now fixed directly between the woman's car and the gang that circled in ragged formation. Claire could see him clearly through her windshield. His frame wasn't massive, and he wasn't armored or armed like the figures who had haunted her nightmares. But there was something about the way he carried himself, shoulders squared, steps grounded, that made him look immovable. She found herself clutching the steering wheel even tighter, as though his composure alone might extend into her own body and calm the tremor of fear that shook her bones. The bikers, still reeling from the sudden violence of his first strike, spread out in a loose semicircle. Their eyes darted from the man on the ground, still groaning, to the puddle of gasoline glistening beneath the pumps. Anger flashed in their faces, but underneath it was hesitation, the kind that men tried to mask with louder curses and heavier footsteps. They had seen what the veteran could do with a single movement. Now they had to decide whether they were willing to push against it again. The leader barked at them to close in, his voice strained with fury that wasn't entirely confident. He wanted control back, wanted to erase the image of his man crumpling to the ground. He jabbed a finger toward Daniel, snarling, "Take him down!" His words echoed off the glass storefront, but his crew didn't rush all at once. Two advanced, swinging chains, while another held a broken bottle like a blade. Daniel's focus never wavered. His pale eyes tracked every shift of their weight, every twitch of their arms. He moved not with haste, but with economy, every gesture precise. When the first chain whipped toward him, he raised the cane and deflected it with clean, ringing strike that would redirecting the metal away from his body. At the same time, he stepped left, placing himself squarely in front of Claire's car door, his body a barrier. Another lunge with the bottle, the jagged edge glinting. Daniel pivoted, striking the man's wrist with the end of the cane. The bottle dropped, shattering on the pavement, its shards scattering at his feet. He didn't chase the man who recoiled in pain, didn't overextend. He simply reset, grounding himself again in front of the car, always returning to that position of defense. To Claire, it looked like a wall was forming where none had been. He wasn't advancing, wasn't trying to overwhelm them. He was holding the line, a silent promise that nothing behind him would be touched. The thought made her throat tighten, her hand pressing instinctively against her stomach as the child within her shifted again. For the first time, the glass around her felt less like a cage and more like protection. The bikers regrouped, circling tighter, their voices harsh with renewed taunts. "He can't last," one muttered, loud enough to reassure himself. Another spat on the ground, circling wide as though searching for a weakness in the veteran's stance. But Daniel gave them nothing. His breathing stayed steady, his shoulders loose but firm, his cane ready in his hand. He didn't need to speak for them to understand. If they wanted her, they would have to go through him. The leader finally stepped forward, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on Daniel. He sneered, trying to mask his hesitation with venom. "You think you can stand there all night? You think you can stop all of us?" Daniel's gaze did not flicker. He shifted his stance again, the cane tapping softly against the pavement. His silence was answer enough. He had stood before lines like this before, and he had never measured survival by numbers. The bikers snarled, their bravado rising again, but their movements betrayed the truth. None of them wanted to be the first to test him again. They had seen his strikes, seen the precision, and they felt the weight of his calm bearing down on them. Daniel Rourke stood unmoving, a single man holding back the tide, every movement controlled, every choice deliberate, the embodiment of a soldier who refused to yield even when the odds pressed hard against him. The standoff broke all at once. The leader's shout tore through the air, and the hesitation that kept his crew at bay cracked under the force of rage. Boots thundered against the pavement as the bikers surged together, chains swinging, fists raised, their voices raw with fury. The night that had hung in tense silence, a heartbeat earlier, now erupted into violence, every sound colliding into chaos. The revving of engines, the clatter of metal, the shouts of men desperate to reassert dominance. Daniel met the storm without flinching. His body moved with the efficiency of muscle memory, honed by years of repetition that had drilled survival into his bones. The first outlaw came in high, chain arcing downward toward his head. Daniel stepped inside the swing, cane striking hard against the man's wrist. The chain fell harmlessly, clattering across the asphalt as its wielder crumpled, clutching his arm. Another rushed low from the side, but Daniel pivoted, his boot hooking behind the man's knee. The biker stumbled forward into his comrade, both of them crashing on the ground in a heap. The others didn't slow. Two more lunged together, one wielding a broken board ripped from the station's fencing, the other with fists clenched tight. Daniel ducked beneath the board, the wood grazing past his shoulder, then drove his cane upward into the attacker's gut with a force that sent him staggering backward, gasping for air. The second man threw a wild punch, but Daniel caught his wrist, twisting it with practiced precision. The snap was audible, sharp and final, followed by a scream that cut across the lot. Claire watched in the car, frozen, her breath shallow. She could see every detail, the blur of movements too fast to track, the way Daniel never wasted motion. He wasn't fighting with the frenzy of the bikers. He was directing them, turning their aggression into weapons against each other. Every time they closed in, he used their momentum, their chaos, their fury, and sent them sprawling into one another. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering to the child inside, her words lost in the storm of violence. A bottle shattered near Daniel's feet, glass skittering across the pavement. One of the men had tried to smash it over his head, but Daniel shifted at the last second, the jagged edge missing him by inches. He retaliated with a swift strike of his cane to the attacker's knee, sending him howling as he collapsed onto the ground. Another outlaw swung a heavy wrench, the metal glinting under the lights. Daniel ducked, the air rushing over his head, then brought the tip of the cane down hard on the man's collarbone. The wrench fell, clattering beside the growing pile of discarded weapons. But still they came. Rage blinded them, pushing them forward even as their numbers thinned. They shouted insults, their fury sharpened by humiliation, their desperation growing with every failed strike. Daniel's breath stayed even, his eyes cold, his movement steady. He shifted constantly, keeping himself positioned between Claire's car and the men, never letting them circle fully behind him. His boots slid across the pavement with the smooth control of a fighter who understood balance better than his enemies understood violence. One outlaw, younger than the rest, charged recklessly with a length of chain wrapped around his fist. He swung wildly, the chain clinking with every strike. Daniel blocked the first, sidestepped the second, then angled his cane into the man's stomach, doubling him over. With a sharp twist, Daniel sent him sprawling into another biker who'd been advancing, their bodies colliding in a tangled limbs. Both went down hard, curses spilling from their mouths as they scrambled to rise. The leader stood back for a moment, watching his men fall one by one. His fury burned hotter, his jaw clenched, but beneath it flickered a glint of fear. He had rallied them with noise and bravado, but now they were being dismantled by a man who barely seemed to break a sweat. Daniel's calm amidst their chaos was worse than a roar. It was a reminder that they were outmatched, not by numbers, but by discipline. The fight dragged seconds into eternity, the night alive with the sounds of fists hitting flesh, with striking bone, of curses blending with groans of pain. Daniel's movements never slowed, his strike precise, his defense seamless. He wasn't fighting for victory. He was fighting to hold the line, to keep the woman in the car shielded from the storm. By the time several of the bikers staggered back, clutching broken wrists, bleeding lips, or twisted ankles, the fury that had driven them began to fracture. Their voices wavered, their curses turning into mutters of disbelief. They had swarmed him, but their numbers had been turned against them, one by one. Daniel stood firm in the center of it all, cane steady, shoulders squared, his chest rising and falling with measured breath. The outlaws had thought to overwhelm him with fury. Instead, they found themselves breaking against him like waves against stone. The echoes of violence faded slowly, like thunder rolling away after a storm. For a few seconds, the lot still quivered with the energy of the fight. The hiss of engines idling, the faint rattle of chains settling on the pavement, the crunch of glass shifting beneath boot soles. But then even that noise ebbed, leaving only the raw, uneven sound of men groaning where they had fallen. The bikers lay scattered across the asphalt, their bravado stripped away, their curses reduced to muffled grunts of pain. One clutched his ribs, breath coming in shallow gasps. Another sat slumped against the pump, head bowed, blood trickling from his nose in thin, dark lines. A third curled on his side, arms wrapped around his stomach, where Daniel's strike had landed clean and hard. The night that had once rung with their laughter was now eerily still, broken only by the chorus of suffering they left in their wake. Daniel stood among them, motionless, his cane planted firmly on the ground. His chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm, not ragged but measured, as though he had willed his breathing to remain calm. His posture hadn't slackened, though the fight was over. He held himself ready, eyes sharp, scanning the scene with the instinct of a man who knew better than to believe the danger was truly gone. Years of combat had taught him that silence could be as deceptive as noise, that men who looked beaten could still lunge if pride demanded it. Claire remained in her car, hands trembling against the steering wheel. The windows were fogged with her shallow breaths, her heart still pounding so violently she could feel in her throat. She hadn't moved during the fight, every second frozen, the terror that a strike, a broken bottle, or a wild swing might shatter the glass and pull her into the chaos. Now, as she looked out, she saw the lot transformed. Men who had strutted and taunted only minutes before were reduced to shapes groveling against the ground. The glow of the canopy lights making their bruises and cuts gleam in harsh detail. The silence itself became oppressive. The buzzing of the lights seemed louder. The drip of spilled gasoline into a shallow puddle echoed like water in a cavern. Somewhere in the distance a night bird cried, and the sound felt jarring against the unnatural quiet of the lot. The air smelled of sweat, blood, and fuel, thick and sharp enough to sting her nose. Daniel finally shifted, the soft scrape of his boot against the concrete drawing every eye that was still capable of following him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than their curses ever had. He walked a few paces, scanning each man on the ground, his grip on the cane unbroken, his steps deliberate. His presence alone was enough to hold them in place, to keep them from testing whether they had the strength left to rise. The leader, still on his feet but hunched from a blow that had nearly dropped him, glared at Daniel from a few steps away. He wiped at the blood on his lip with the back of his hand, his expression torn between rage and disbelief. His crew's groans filled the space around them, making it harder for him to pretend the balance of power hadn't shifted. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Claire pressed her palm against her belly, whispering soft words she barely heard herself. The baby shifted faintly, and she clung to that small movement as proof that they were both still safe. Her eyes drifted back to the figure standing guard between her and the outlaws. The silence after the storm felt more fragile than the chaos had. It was the kind of quiet that made the air heavy, the kind that warned of what still lingered unsaid. The bikers didn't laugh anymore. They didn't mock. Their voices were reduced to ragged breaths and muffled groans, a broken chorus beneath the buzzing lights. The gas station had become a different place entirely. No longer their playground, no longer their stage. It was a field marked by defeat, and Daniel Rourke stood at its center, unshaken, while the night closed in around the weight of what had just unfolded. The silence lingered, so heavy that Claire could hear the faint ticking of her cooling engine, every sound magnified in the strange stillness that followed violence. The bikers lay scattered across the lot, their groans dull and muted, stripped of their earlier cruelty. Daniel stood alone in the center, his shoulders squared, his cane steady, as though the fight hadn't taken a piece from him at all. He looked carved out of the night itself, like he had been standing there long before the chaos began. Claire pressed her hand against her chest, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of her heart. Her breath came shallow, trembling, each inhale catching as though her lungs couldn't quite remember how to work properly. The baby shifted inside her, a small, anxious movement that made her press her other hand to her belly in reflexive comfort. She stared through the windshield at the figure who had stood between her and danger, the man who had turned what should have been her worst night into something survivable. She hesitated before moving. Her hand hovered over the door handle, her body urging her to stay put, to keep the thin barrier of glass between herself and the night. But another part of her, stronger, steadier, pushed her forward. With a shaky exhale, she unlocked the door and stepped out, the cool air hitting her face immediately, thick with gasoline and smoke. Her legs wobbled as though they'd forgotten how to hold her weight, but she steadied herself with one hand against the frame of the car. Daniel turned his head at the sound, his eyes meeting hers without expression. Pale, steady, unreadable. He didn't move toward her, didn't speak, just waited, as though it was her choice whether the silence would break. Claire swallowed, her throat dry. Her voice came out softer than she intended, but it carried enough to reach him. Who are you?" Her words trembled as much as her hands, but the question had to be asked. She needed to know the name of the man who had just stood against a gang of outlaws for her sake, who had shielded her child without asking for anything in return. For a moment, he didn't answer. He simply looked at her, his face a map of lines etched deep by years, his silence stretching long enough to make her wonder if he had even heard. Then at last his lips parted, and his voice came low, steady and without hesitation. Nobody important. The word struck her harder than any explanation could have. Nobody important. He said it as if it were fact, as if the way he had dismantled half a dozen men meant nothing, as if his presence in the middle of her nightmare had been coincidence rather than choice. She blinked, unsure how to respond, her throat tight with the weight of gratitude that had no place to go. She wanted to protest, to tell him that what he had done was everything, that she and her child might not be alive without him. But the calm finality in his tone stopped her. He wasn't a man looking for recognition. He wasn't searching for thanks or acknowledgement. He was simply there, and now, as far as he was concerned, the moment was already done. Claire's hands shook as she hugged her coat tighter around herself. She whispered, "You saved us." The words felt too small, too fragile, but they were all she could manage. Daniel's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, then shifted away, scanning the lot once again as if searching for signs the fight might not be finished. He gave a small nod, more to himself than to her. His silence returned, heavy and unyielding, leaving her with a sense that she had only glimpsed the surface of a man carrying far more than he would ever admit. The biker's groans filled the background, the broken soundtrack of the night. But between Claire and Daniel, it was quiet again, a quiet that said as much as his words. Nobody important. Yet as she stood trembling in the cold air, she knew the truth was the opposite. This man, whoever he was, had changed the course of her life in a single night, and he didn't even think it mattered. The wind cut sharp across the empty lot, carrying with it the heavy smell of spilled fuel and the faint sting of broken glass. Claire stood beside her car, her body trembling in the aftermath, her breath uneven. She had managed to step out, though her knees still wavered as though each moment might send her collapsing back into the seat. Her purse, clutched too loosely in her shaking hand, slipped against her hip and tumbled onto the pavement. The sound of contents spilling across the asphalt startled her more than it should have. Keys clinking, a phone skidding, loose papers fluttering under the pull of the night breeze. She bent awkwardly, one hand cradling her stomach as the other reached down, but her movements were clumsy. A lipstick rolled further away. A small bottle of prenatal vitamins clattered near a crack in the concrete. Her fingers fumbled, unable to gather them quickly. She bit down on her lip, frustration nodding with fear. Daniel moved forward without a word. The scrape of his boots against the ground was steady, unhurried, carrying none of the urgency that had filled the last few minutes. He crouched with surprising ease for a man who leaned on a cane, one hand reaching out to collect the scattered items. His movements were efficient, deliberate. The same control he had carried in the fight now turned toward something small and ordinary. Claire glanced at him, unsure if she should speak, unsure if gratitude would only feel inadequate. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the weight of what he was doing. He simply gathered what she had dropped, his scarred fingers careful as they lifted the things she needed most. It was when he picked up a folded scrap of paper that something else slipped free from the inside pocket of his jacket. It hit the ground with a faint thud, half hidden beneath the shadow of his knee. Claire saw it before he did. A worn leather wallet, edges frayed. So old it looked as though it had survived years of weather and time. When he lifted it quickly, the flap opened just enough for a small car to slide free. The light from the overhead canopy caught the surface of it. She saw the faded emblem first, the eagle and anchor stamped faintly into the corner. The card itself was creased and softened at the edges, the laminate cloudy with years of wear. Across the top, just clear enough in the glare of the fluorescent lights, were the words, United States Marine Corps. Her eyes linger on the photograph, younger but unmistakably him, his jaw sharper, his hair darker, his expression stern even in stillness. Beneath it, his name printed in block letters, the ink smudge from years of handling. She drew in a breath, sharp and involuntary, the truth slipping into place before she could stop it. Daniel noticed the direction of her gaze. His hand closed over the wallet in an instant, the motion quick but not panicked. He slid the card back into its place, folding the leather shut with a quiet finality. When he looked at her, his expression remained calm, though there was a shadow in his eyes, a heaviness that spoke more than words. Claire straightened slowly, clutching the items he had already returned to her. She didn't ask a question outright. She didn't need to. The badge itself had been answer enough. She had wondered who he was, why it stood against so many without hesitation. Now she understood, at least in part. The silence, the discipline, the way his body moved with precision, it all pointed back to that single truth. "You were a Marine," she whispered, her voice trembling more from awe than fear. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. He slid the wallet back into his pocket with a practiced motion, as though sealing away a piece of himself. He said simply, his tone quiet, his words leaving no room for further questions. The air between them felt different now, heavier with understanding. Claire looked down at the belongings in her hands, then back at the man who had shielded her. The badge in his wallet had spoken volumes, even if he had no interest in explaining further. He had once belonged to something greater, carried duties and burdens that most could never imagine. And though he might call himself nobody important, the truth was clear. The way of his past had never left him. It was written in the way he stood, the way he fought, and in the quiet sacrifice of stepping into danger for someone he didn't know. Claire clutched her purse tighter, her heart thudding. For the first time since the night began, she felt less like a victim stranded under harsh lights and more like someone standing at the edge of a story she had only glimpsed. The badge had answered her question, but also left her with another. What had driven a Marine, once part of a force larger than himself, to a lonely gas station on a forgotten stretch of highway, where his silence carried more weight than his name? The weight of the night settled heavier once the chaos ebbed. The bikers, groaning and scattered, no longer posed an immediate threat. Yet the air still throbbed with the residue of danger. Claire stood by her car, purse clutched tight against her chest, her breath uneven. The man before her, this quiet veteran who had held a line for her, seemed immovable, a figure who belonged more to the storm than to the silence that followed it. His pale eyes had returned to their watchful stillness, but Claire felt the moment slipping into something fragile, a place where words needed to be spoken or else the silence would consume her whole. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, the gasoline-laced air scraping as she tried to find her voice. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, her fingers curling protectively over the swell that had guided every choice she had made these past months. For so long she had hidden her story, locked it behind quiet explanations and excuses. But here in the raw aftermath, the truth pressed to the surface. "I'm 7 months along," she whispered at first, the words almost carried off by the hum of the lights overhead. She glanced at Daniel, unsure if he would even care, but his eyes settled on her, steady, waiting. Encouraged, she drew in another breath, this time speaking louder, though her voice still trembled. "I'm pregnant. I've been on the road for 2 days now. I'm trying to get away." Her voice cracked on the last word, and the tremor in her hands betrayed more than she wanted. She looked down, ashamed of the tears stinging her eyes. But once the words had started, there was no holding them back. "My ex," she continued, her words broken into fragments. He doesn't stop. Doesn't stop calling, showing up, threatening. I thought I could make it work. I thought maybe it was just the stress, but it only got worse. And when I found out I was carrying this child, I knew if I stayed, her breath hitched, and she pressed her palm tighter against her stomach, the baby shifting faintly as if in response. If I stayed, he'd find a way to break both of us. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, a harsh chorus against a quiet confession. Claire's eyes blurred as she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. So I packed what I could. Papers, clothes, just enough money for gas. My sister lives 3 states over. She said she'd take me in, that I could start fresh. I've been driving day and night, stopping only when I had to. And tonight, the car just... She gestured weakly toward the stalled vehicle, her voice trailing off into a hollow laugh that held no humor. Of course it picked now to die. She blinked against the tears that slipped free, brushing them away quickly as though embarrassed. Her shoulders shook, not just from fear, but from the release of carrying too much alone for too long. She had told herself she could handle it. That running was enough. That endurance would save her. But standing here, under the cold canopy lights, the truth laid itself bare. Daniel hadn't moved while she spoke. He stood rooted, his face unreadable, his silence heavy but not dismissive. It was the kind of listening she hadn't known in years. Not impatient, not judgmental, just present. His eyes flicked once to the curve of her stomach, then back to her face. And though he gave no nod, no word of acknowledgement, she felt the weight of understanding settle between them. "I just want her to be safe," Claire said finally, her hand pressing firmly against her belly as though cradling the future itself. Her voice steady for the first time, quiet but resolute. "That's all I want now. A place where he can't reach us. A chance to raise her without fear." The night seemed to lean closer, the silence wrapping around her words. For the first time, Claire did not feel entirely invisible in her struggle. She had spoken her story aloud, and though it felt raw and exposed, it no longer lived only inside her. The man before her had heard it, and somehow that mattered more than she could explain. Daniel listened to Claire's trembling words without interruption, his posture steady as she let the pieces of her story fall into the open air. Her voice lingered even after she stopped speaking, carried in the silence that followed. She clutched her stomach, eyes wet with exhaustion, but in that moment she was not just speaking for herself. She was speaking for the life she carried, for the chance she refused to let slip away. Daniel understood that kind of weight. He had carried his own, though it was carved differently. Born in another place, under skies stained by smoke and fire. For a long time, he said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the ground, on the cracks in the asphalt filled with gasoline and glass, as though the answer might be written there. Then, slowly, he drew in a breath and let it out, his voice low and deliberate when it came. "I wore that uniform once. The badge you saw, it's real. I was a Marine." The words seemed to hang heavy, like a confession dragged reluctantly into the open. Claire blinked, startled, unsure if she should speak. He spared need. "I wasn't just any Marine," he continued, his tone flat, but edged with something sharp beneath it. "I was decorated. Commendations, medals. Things they hand out for doing what you're told, for surviving when others don't. They call me disciplined, reliable, a man who could hold the line." He paused, the corner of his mouth tightening, though it was not a smile. "But the truth is, all those ribbons don't weigh anything compared to the faces you leave behind." His gaze shifted upward, past her, past the gas station, to somewhere far beyond the reach of the buzzing lights. We were on patrol overseas, a town no one back home could find on a map, a place where the walls all looked the same, and every alley felt like a trap. I had a squad under me, young men, some barely more than boys. They trusted me. They believed I could get them home. His grip on the cane tightened, the scarred knuckles whitening. One of them, Corporal Hayes, he didn't. The silence stretched again, but this time it was thick with memory. His voice, when it returned, was quieter. "I was supposed to watch the flank. I told myself I could see everything, control everything. But I missed it. an explosion. Improvised, hidden, waiting for us. I heard it before I saw it. By the time I got to him, he was already gone. Daniel's pale eyes closed briefly, the faint lines around them deepening. The others lived. They called me a hero for pulling them out after. But every time someone shook my hand, all I could think about was the one I left on the ground. His parents sent me letters. They thanked me. They told me. He looked up to me. They didn't know that I replayed that day every night, hearing the blast, seeing the dust, reaching too late. He looked back at Claire then, his expression hard but not unkind. So when you ask who I am, when I tell you I'm no but important, that's the truth as I see it. I left the Corps after that. Couldn't wear the uniform anymore. Couldn't stand in front of anyone else and pretend I deserved the trust they put in me. The medals sit in a box I don't open. The badge. He tapped his jacket lightly, where the wallet was tucked away. That's just a reminder of what I failed to do. The fluorescent lights hummed louder, or maybe it only felt that way as his words sank into the quiet. Claire stared at him, her lips parted but no words finding their way out. She saw the steadiness in his posture differently now. Not just the discipline of a soldier, but the weight of a man carrying something he would never set down. Daniel shifted his cane, grounding it firmly against the asphalt. I'm not the man they used to call reliable. I'm not the hero they pin medals on. I'm just someone who's still trying to make sense of why I came home when others didn't. His gaze softened slightly as it returned to her. Tonight, maybe standing here was the closest thing to sense I found in a long while. Claire pressed her hand against her stomach, feeling the faint movement of the child within. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that saving them mattered, that it was not nothing. But as she looked at him, scarred, silent, and steady, she understood that his burden was not something words could lift. It was his, carried like the cane in his hand, a part of him that defined the way he walked through the world. And yet, despite the weight, he had chosen to stand for her tonight. That truth lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. The night had grown unervingly still, the kind of silence that seemed like a fragile glass dome placed over the gas station. The fallen bikers shifted and groaned on the pavement, their bravado stripped away, their leader standing rigid with humiliation carved deep into his face. He wiped the blood from his lip, his jaw tight, his glare fixed on Daniel, as though the weight of his shame could be lessened if only he could see this man undone. For a moment, the stillness stretched long, broken only by the buzz of the canopy lights and the faint drip of gasoline pooling beneath the pumps. Then came the sound. At first it was faint, a low vibration that trembled at the edge of hearing, like thunder rolling over distant hills. Daniel lifted his head slightly, his body still but alert, while Claire felt her chest tighten as though her heart recognized the sound before her mind could place it. The vibrations grew louder, closer, until the air itself seemed to hum. It was a roar of more engines, heavy and relentless, coming down the highway toward the station. Headlights cut through the dark, swinging wildly across the cracked asphalt. One, then another, then several more. The reinforcements arrived in a column, their presence unmistakable. The leader straightened, his shoulders squaring as the tide shifted back into his favor. The corner of his mouth twitched into a grim smile, the kind that promised vengeance. The new arrivals slowed only enough to make their presence known, before pulling into the lot with deliberate aggression. Tires screeched, the smell of rubber burning briefly before the engines roared once again, refusing quiet even as they idled. Chrome gleamed under the canopy, leather jackets caught the harsh light, and the silence that had reigned moments before was drowned in the violent growl of machines. Claire's knees buckled, and she steadied herself against the car door, her breath catching. She had thought, for a fleeting moment, that it was over, that the stranger had ended the nightmare. But the sound of those engines erased the hope she had begun to feel. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering to the child inside, her voice shaking. "Stay with me. Just stay with me." Daniel didn't move. He stood with his cane planted firmly against the ground, his posture steady even as the odds multiplied. His eyes narrowed slightly, assessing the newcomers as they swung off their bikes, their boots striking the ground in heavy rhythm. He had known it wasn't finished. Men like these didn't tolerate defeat, and humiliation demanded reinforcements. He had seen it before in villages where enemies called for backup. In cities where one skirmish always drew another, war had taught him that silence after victory was often only a pause before the next wave. The leader's voice rose above the engines, loud and triumphant now that his men had doubled. "Thought you could walk in here and play, hero," he shouted at Daniel, his chest puffed with renewed confidence. "You had your fun, old man, but now it's over. Now you pay." The new group fanned out quickly, circling, their faces set in cruel anticipation. They looked at their fallen comrades and sneered, spitting on the ground, promising retribution without speaking a word. The air thickened with the smell of fuel and sweat, with the weight of inevitability. Claire's vision blurred as tears welled, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She wanted to scream, to beg Daniel to leave, to save himself before he was swallowed by sheer numbers. But when she looked at him, she saw no fear, no hesitation. His silence held a different kind of power, one that made her heart steady despite the roar surrounding them. The engines rumbled louder, as if the machines themselves were impatient for violence. The bikers cracked their knuckles, tightened their grips on chains and knives, and stepped closer. The fragile stillness of the aftermath was gone, replaced by a storm-gathering strength. The night that had almost ended had been pulled back into chaos, and the battle was far from finished. Claire's breath quickened the moment the reinforcements spread across the lot, their engines still snarling like restless beasts under the canopy. The new arrivals carried themselves differently from the first group, more deliberate, less mocking, eyes fixed sharply on the man who had laid their comrades low. The gleam of knives, the rattle of chains, the hard glint of brass knuckles in the fluorescent light, all of it turned the gas station into something closer to a battlefield than a roadside stop. She pressed her back against the car, her trembling hands clutching the metal frame as though it could anchor her. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, panic clawing its way up her throat. The baby shifted inside her, a small, insistent kick against her ribs, as if reminding her that every second of fear rippled into more than just her own body. Her mouth opened before she realized she was speaking. "You have to go," she blurted, her voice breaking to the mechanical growl of engines. "Please, just leave. They'll kill you if you stay. They'll kill us both." Her words came out ragged, frantic, spilling without pause. She took a step closer to him, shaking her head as if trying to force sense into him. "You've already done enough. More than anyone else ever would. Just go. I can handle it. I'll find a way." She didn't believe the last sentence even as she said it, but the desperation in her voice pushed her to pretend. Daniel turned his head toward her, his pale eyes catching the light, calm and steady even in the face of a gathering storm. He didn't flinch at the noise, didn't seem moved by the circle of men tightening around them. His breathing remained slow, deliberate, as though he were centering himself against the chaos building at the edges. "Run," she urged again, her voice cracking. "Please, if you stay, they'll—" She couldn't finish, couldn't bring herself to speak the end she feared most. Daniel adjusted the grip on his cane, the wood tapping once against concrete, a sound almost delicate against the rumbling engines. His gaze lingered on her, steady, unwavering, before he finally spoke. His voice was low, even, and carried not a hint of fear. "Running was never my way." The words sank into her like stone into water, rippling outward with weight. They were not boastful, not shouted to intimidate, but spoken with a simple certainty that allowed no argument. His tone made clear that it wasn't stubbornness holding him there. It was identity. Running was for men who had the option to look away. Daniel had long ago lost that option. Claire shook her head, tears breaking free, despite her effort to contain them. "You don't understand. They're too many. You can't." "I understand," he interrupted gently, though his eyes never left a line of bikers watching, waiting for command to strike. His voice remained calm, like a man stating fact rather than opinion. "I know what it looks like. I know what it means. I've stood against worse than this. And if they want her," his gaze flicked briefly toward Claire's stomach, acknowledging the life she carried, "they'll have to go through me first." Her lips trembled, caught between gratitude and despair. She wanted to scream at him, to force him into the car, to demand that he save himself instead of throwing his life into a fight that couldn't be won. But his presence pressed against her panic, stilling it even as fear surged. He looked like a man who had made peace with choices long before this night, who had lived too long with regret to turn away from another chance to stand where it mattered. The outlaws began to jeer again, their leader raising his hand, signaling that the reprieve was ending. Engines revved louder, filling the lot with a sound that vibrated in Claire's bones. She whispered, almost pleading, "Why? Why would you stay for someone you don't even know?" Daniel's reply was quiet, but it carried more weight than the roar around them. "Because I couldn't leave when someone needed me again. Not this time." The word silencer rooted her to the spot. For a fleeting moment, despite the terror pressing in from every direction, Claire's heartbeat steadied. He would not run, and whether that doomed them both or saved them, she understood she was no longer alone. The night closed in tighter, the buzzing canopy lights flickering, as if the strain of the moment pressed down even on the wiring overhead. The engines of the newly arrived motorcycles filled the lot with their guttural rumble, drowning out the weaker sounds of glass crunching under boots and the shallow groans of the men already sprawled across the pavement. The reinforcements fanned out, tightening the circle, their boots deliberate, their faces hardened into expressions that promised violence. The air reeked of gasoline, sweat, and smoke, heavy and choking. At the center of it all stood Daniel Rourke. His cane was planted firmly on the ground, his posture straight, his pale eyes fixed forward without a tremor. The scars on his hands caught the light as he shifted his grip, his body angled slightly to shield Claire and the car behind him. He carried no weapon beyond the cane, no armor but his silence, yet something in his stance spoke louder than any threat. He looked like a man anchored in place, unmovable, as though the storm circling him could break itself against him but never push him back. The leader of the outlaws stepped forward, emboldened by the fresh wave of men at his back. His lips still bled from earlier, and the sting of humiliation sharpened his voice. "You really think you're walking away tonight?" he snarled, his tone pitched to carry over the engines. He gestured to the bodies of his fallen men. "You made a mistake, old man. You hurt mine. You made us look weak. And now, we're going to bury you right here on this pavement." The circle of bikers muttered their approval, chains rattling, knives flashing faintly as they shifted in anticipation. Yet despite their noise, their bravado, none of them stepped in first. Daniel's calm was unsettling, a weight pressing back against the storm they tried to summon. He did not respond with taunts or boasts. Instead, he let the silence stretch. The flickering lights above seemed to pulse with it, the buzzing filling the space between his stillness and their threats. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying a quiet authority that forced its way through the roar of engines. "If you come for her, you'll have to go through me. Every one of you." The words weren't shouted, weren't sharpened into anger. They were delivered like fact, simple and irrefutable. His tone made it clear he wasn't trying to intimidate. He was only describing how the night would unfold if they pushed forward. The leader smirked, though his eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of unease. He spat on the ground, his boots scraping against the pavement as he closed the distance by another step. "You think a stick and a stare make you untouchable? You're one man, and we've got a dozen ready to tear you apart." Daniel shifted the cane slightly, its base tapping softly against the asphalt. His eyes did not move from the man in front of him. "Numbers don't win fights," he said, voice as calm as the night was tense. "Discipline does. And I've lived longer than I should have because I never forgot that." The words hung heavy, pressing down on the circle of men. Some shifted their weight, their bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. They had expected bluster, maybe even begging. They hadn't expected a man who spoke as though death was no stranger, who met their numbers not with fear, but with a quiet certainty that unsettled the air around them. Claire pressed her back harder against the car, her hand trembling against her stomach. She wanted to scream at Daniel to stop, to get inside, to flee while there was still a sliver of chance. But she couldn't. His calmness rooted her where she stood, forcing her to watch the impossible. One man with cane standing against a circle of outlaws under lights that buzzed and threatened to blink out at any moment. The engines roared again as several bikers revved their throttles, impatient for blood. The leader raised his hand as if to give the signal, but for the briefest instant he hesitated. His men's eyes darted between him and the veteran who refused to move. The standoff held, brittle as glass, stretched tight by pride and silence, by the knowledge that the next move would decide whether the night ended in retreat or ruin. Daniel did not move, did not blink. His stillness became the center of the storm, and the outlaws, for all their noise and numbers, could not ignore the weight of a man who had already chosen not to yield. The tension broke, not with a shout, but with movement. One of the younger outlaws, eager to prove himself, lunged first. The glint of his knife caught the light as he drove forward, the blade flashing with crude confidence. Daniel did not step back. Instead, his cane rose in a sharp, efficient motion, knocking the attacker's wrist aside. The knife clattered to the ground, the steel ringing against the pavement before sliding into the shadows. The biker stumbled past him, off balance, caught more by his own momentum than by any force Daniel exerted. The circle of men hissed in anger, but none stepped forward quickly enough to catch the knife before it was lost in the dark. Another came from Daniel's left, chain swinging in a wide arc meant to crush his shoulder. Daniel pivoted, his movements fluid, the cane snapping upward to hook the chain mid-swing. With a twist of his wrist and sharp pull, he yanked it free from the outlaw's grip. The man staggered, clutching at air, his surprise written across his face before Daniel swung the chain aside and let it drop, useless. It hit the ground with a heavy clink, joining the knife in the growing pile of discarded weapons. The others pressing harder, voices raised, their bravado beginning to fray. Another boot came toward him, a heavy kick aimed low. Daniel shifted his weight just enough, sweeping his cane behind the biker's leg. The man's foot caught, and with a sharp tug, Daniel sent him crashing backward. The outlaw hit the ground with a thud, the air rushing from his lungs in a groan that carried across the lot. Each move Daniel made was precise, controlled. There was no wasted effort, no flourish. He didn't fight with fury. He fought with discipline, as though every strike had already been calculated before the man even stepped forward. Claire saw from behind the car window how he read their movements, anticipated the angles, used their size and speed against them. For every weapon raised, he had an answer. For every lunge, he had a counter. Another swung a broken bottle, the jagged edge whistling past Daniel's cheek. The veteran sidestepped, his cane driving hard into the man's ribs. The bottle slipped from his fingers, shattering on the ground as he folded over, wheezing. Yet another charge, fists raised. But Daniel's strike met his forearm with such force that the man recoiled instantly, cradling the limb as though it had been snapped. The lot became a series of short, brutal lessons. One man had his arm twisted until he dropped his weapon. Another was forced to the ground by the sweep of Daniel's boot. Each attempt ended the same. Their fury disarmed, their pride dismantled one by one. The pile of weapons at his feet grew, a small graveyard of steel and glass, while the men who had carried them staggered and fell, stripped of the tools they thought made them dangerous. Claire pressed her hand to her mouth, her breath caught in awe as much as fear. She had seen men swing wildly, shout threats, flaunt strength to mask insecurity. But what Daniel carried was different. His every motion came from somewhere deep, somewhere drilled into him long before this night. He wasn't merely stronger or faster. He was unyielding because he knew how to turn chaos into control. The leader finally stepped forward, fury blazing in his eyes as he watched his men fall around him. His voice rang out, sharp and angry, but beneath it lay the first hint of fear. The others, groaning on the pavement, were proof enough that this was not the easy victory they had imagined. Daniel's cane tapped once against the ground, steady and unshaken, as he reset his stance. His pale eyes swept across the circle again, calm and certain, and the message was clear without words. If they wanted more, he would strip them of it piece by piece. The lot grew heavy with silence again, broken only by the moans of the disarmed and the rattling breath of engines left idling. The outlaws had come expecting an easy conquest. Instead, they found themselves undone one by a man who carried nothing but discipline, a wooden cane, and the will to stand unbroken. The lot was littered with the evidence of the fight. Broken bottles, chains coiled uselessly on the ground, knives kicked out of reach. Men groaned where they had fallen, some clutching ribs, others holding twisted wrists or bruised faces. The air reeked of sweat and gasoline, heavy and metallic, while the buzzing lights above seemed almost too bright, exposing the wreckage of pride scattered across the cracked pavement. Through it all, Daniel stood in the center, his shoulders squared, his cane planted firmly in the ground as though it rooted him there. His breathing was steady, controlled, the same as it had been when he first stepped across the asphalt. The leader remained upright, though barely. His face was mottled with bruises, one eye swelling shut, blood smeared across his chin from a split lip. The leather vest that once made him look imposing now sagged as he hunched forward, his chest heaving. He looked around at his men, their once mocking laughter now reduced to pained groans and stunned silence. The reinforcements who had roared in with such confidence shifted uneasily on their feet, their bravado cracked by the sight of so many of their own dismantled one by one. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was thick, but different now. It was no longer the kind of anticipation that precedes violence. It was the weight of realization. They had tested him. They had come with numbers, weapons, fury, and arrogance. And still, he stood unshaken, his eyes calm, his grip steady. The night had proven something they hadn't wanted to believe. The leader spat onto the ground, the red flecked with spit and grit, his jaw clenched tight. He wanted to press forward, to salvage the pride that had been stripped from him under the harsh glare of the canopy lights. But his men weren't moving. Their hesitation told him everything he needed to know. They had no stomach left for this fight. No to risk another clash with a man who had faced them down with nothing but a cane and a silence that carried more weight than their threats. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stillness was command enough, his quiet defiance louder than any warning. The leader's gaze flicked to him once more, and what he saw there was not mockery, not triumph, but something far worse for his pride, discipline, unbroken and unafraid. Finally, with a grunt that was more frustration than defiance, the leader lifted his hand. It wasn't a gesture of victory. It wasn't even one of anger. It was a signal, a call for retreat. He turned his head slightly, muttering under his breath, and the men who were still standing began to back away, dragging their wounded with them. Boots scraped against the asphalt, chains rattled weakly, and engines roared back to life as they began to mount their bikes. The sound of motors filled the lot again, but this time it wasn't the sound of power. It was a sound of retreat, the engines growling as the men who had once controlled the night now sought to escape it. Their headlights swung across the cracked pavement, shadows dancing wildly across the broken bottles and blood-stained ground before disappearing down the road. The leader lingered for a heartbeat longer, his swollen face twisted in something between hatred and respect. His voice was low, bitter, almost grudging. This ain't over. But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed the truth. Something had shifted tonight, something no words could take back. He gave one last glance at Daniel before swinging onto his bike. The machine roared to life, and then he was gone, the tail lights shrinking into the darkness beyond the station. The silence that followed was vast, heavier than before. Claire stood by her car, one hand pressed at her stomach, her other clutching the frame of the door. She had witnessed men reduced from wolves to wounded strays, not by violence alone, but by the quiet discipline of one man who refused to bend. She watched Daniel, who hadn't moved, who hadn't lowered his guard, even as the engines faded into the distance. The fight was finished. The outlaws had left, humiliated, their leader forced to call a retreat. But what lingered in the lot was more than defeat. It was respect, earned not through fear, not through dominance, but through the calm, immovable will of a man who stood when others would have run. The roar of engines faded into the night, leaving behind only the hum of fluorescent lights and the ragged breath of the men still groaning on the pavement. The gas station lot, moments before a battlefield, now seemed frozen in time. Shards of glass glinted in the glow. The dark sheen of gasoline spread slick across the concrete, and the smell of smoke and sweat lingered heavy in the air. Daniel stood in the middle of it all, cane planted firmly, his eyes scanning the perimeter one last time. His silence pressed down like a weight, and though the fight was over, he didn't let himself relax. Old instincts told him danger could return the moment he dropped his guard. Claire leaned against her car, one arm wrapped protectively around her stomach, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. The child stirred within her, restless as though it, too, could feel the lingering energy crackling in the night. She looked at Daniel, scarred calm, unmoving, and a shiver went through her. He looked less like a man and more like a sentinel carved into the asphalt, as though he'd been standing there long before she arrived and would remain long after she left. The quiet didn't last. It began with a faint creak of hinges, the sound of a door opening down the block. Then another. Lights flicked on in the windows of houses facing the station, curtains shifting as shadows moved behind them. The locals had heard the fight, the engines, the crash of glass. They had heard the shouts and the laughter that had turned into groans. Now they peered out cautiously, faces half hidden in shadow, their whispers barely audible but carrying on the still air. "Who is he?" a woman asked in hushed tones from behind a screen door. "Just one man," came another voice, incredulous. "Took them all down." The words rippled, passed from one window to the next. People pressed closer to their curtains, curiosity warring with fear. For months, maybe longer, the Outlaws had claimed the nights in places like this, rolling in whenever they pleased, taking what they wanted, leaving fear behind. No one had stood against them. No one had dared. And yet tonight, under the buzzing lights of a forgotten gas station, someone had. A man on a porch leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the figure standing tall among the broken bodies. "That wasn't luck," he muttered, half to himself. That was a soldier. The cashier from the convenience store reappeared at last, hovering in the doorway, but refusing to step fully outside. He looked wide-eyed at the carnage, his hands gripping the frame of the door as if for support. He whispered something to the woman behind him, and she ducked back into the store, her own face pale. Even those who had hidden during the fight could feel the change now. The fear that kept them silent was giving way to something else. Curiosity, awe, the first fragile stirrings of respect. Claire glanced around, noticing the shifting curtains, the silhouettes watching. Her cheeks burned at the thought of being seen in her vulnerability. But then her gaze drifted back to Daniel. He didn't seem to notice or care about the eyes on him. His shoulders remained squared, his breathing measured, his silence unbroken. The whispers grew bolder as the minutes passed. Some murmured the fight in disbelief. Others spoke of how the gang had been beaten, but all circled back to the same question. Who was the man with the cane? The one who had faced them all? Stories had already begun forming, exaggerated by awe. A boy on a porch whispered excitedly that he saw the man move faster than anyone should be able to. A woman clutched her robe tighter, murmuring that it was as if he had walked out of a war and into their town. Inside her car, Claire sank into the seat at last, exhausted but no longer paralyzed by fear. The worst had passed, though the memory of it would not leave her. Her eyes lingered on Daniel through the windshield. He had told her he was nobody important. Yet the whispers growing in the night said otherwise. The Outlaws had left humiliated, their leader forced into retreat. And in their place, a different power settled over the town, a quiet story already spreading from one window to another. A man had stood against them, unshaken, and sent them fleeing into the dark. By morning, the whispers would carry further, retold in diners and on front porches, shaping into legend. For now, the gas station lay still, broken glass crunching faintly as Daniel finally shifted his stance. The quiet aftermath wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of something different, something the locals hadn't felt in years. For the first time, they believed the Outlaws could be beaten. The lot was settling into an uneasy stillness, broken only by the occasional groan from the beaten men who hadn't yet limped away. Claire sat behind the wheel of her car, staring at the dead dashboard lights as if sheer willpower might coax them back to life. The vehicle had betrayed her at the worst possible moment, and now the thought of being stranded again, especially after everything, sent another wave of fear through her chest. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel, her hand clutching her stomach, whispering to the child inside, promising safety, though she had no idea how to provide it. Daniel approached slowly, his boots crunching over shards of glass, his cane tapping against the pavement. He stopped beside her window, his voice low and even. "Pop the hood." Claire blinked, lifting her head. "It won't start," she murmured, her voice still unsteady. "I've tried." "Pop the hood," he repeated, not unkindly but with quiet certainty that left no room for argument. Her trembling hand reached for the latch, and with a creak the hood lifted. Daniel set the cane against the bumper, leaned forward, and peered into the engine. His scarred hands moved with surprising familiarity, tracing wires, checking connections, adjusting things that looked meaningless to her but seemed to settle into place beneath his touch. The harsh canopy light washed over his weathered face, highlighting the lines of focus etched deep into it. Claire stepped out, hugging her coat around her against the cold. She watched him work, her voice breaking the silence after a long pause. "You've done this before?" He gave a faint grunt, not quite a laugh. Engines don't fight back. They just need patience. He tightened a loose clamp, then reached deeper into the tangle of metal. His movements were efficient, the same economy she had seen in his strikes earlier, each one purposeful. After a few minutes, he straightened, wiping his hands on his jacket as though it mattered little. "Try it now." Claire slid back into the seat, heart pounding as she turned the key. For a second there was nothing, only the familiar sputter of defeat. But then, with a low groan, the engine caught. The dashboard flickered to life, headlights flaring into the night. Relief washed over her so quickly that tears blurred her vision. Daniel closed the hood with a heavy thud, retrieving his cane from where it leaned. "It'll run," he said. "Not far, not fast, but enough." She stepped out again, her voice shaky but insistent. "What about you? You can't stay here. If they come back." "I've got a truck." He nodded toward the edge of the lot, where an old pickup sat half hidden in shadow. Its paint was worn, the bed rusted, but it looked sturdy, dependable, like its owner. "I'll follow. If it dies again, I'll be there." Her throat tightened, words of thanks rising but catching before they could leave. She could only nod, swallowing hard as she slid back into the driver's seat. The engine rattled but held steady. Daniel climbed into his truck with the same deliberate calm he carried everywhere, the engine roaring to life after a single turn of the key. He pulled out slowly, positioning himself behind her car, headlights casting a steady glow across the cracked pavement. Claire shifted into gear, the wheels crunching over debris as she eased toward the road. The gas station receded in the rearview mirror, its harsh lights flickering against the broken bodies still dragging themselves into the dark. Ahead stretched a long highway, empty and uncertain, but no longer face alone. Behind her, steady as a shadow, the battered truck followed, its presence a quiet promise that the night would not swallow her whole. For the first time in days, Claire felt the weight in her chest ease. The baby shifted gently, and she whispered into the hum of the engine, "We're safe now." She wasn't sure how far they'd make it or what waited beyond the state line. But with Daniel's truck trailing close behind, she believed the promise of survival had finally become real. The highway stretched ahead in a ribbon of faded blacktop, the yellow lines worn thin by years of trucks and travelers passing through. Claire's hands gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles pale, though the car rattled forward with more strength than she'd expected after Daniel's adjustments. In the rear-view mirror, she could see the steady glow of his truck's headlights, unwavering, keeping perfect distance behind her as if tethered to her by something stronger than steel. Every time the engine coughed, her heart jumped, but the sight of that truck calmed her again. He was still there. He hadn't left. The road was empty, save for the occasional flicker of porch lights from distant farmhouses. Claire's mind churned with everything that had happened, the laughter of the bikers still echoing faintly in her ears, the thud of fists on her car, the crack of Daniel's cane as it struck. Her hand drifted down to her belly, feeling the faint stirrings of life within. She whispered something soft to her child, half prayer, half promise, then glanced once more in the mirror. The headlights hadn't moved. When the car began to rattle harder on a stretch of uneven road, she pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. The engine coughed but didn't stall. She let idle as Daniel's truck rolled up behind her, the beams dimming as he parked. He climbed out slowly, leaning on the cane, his face unreadable in the wash of light. She lowered her window, her voice unsteady but firm enough to bridge the silence. "Why?" The words slipped out before she could form more. She swallowed, forcing herself to continue. "Why did you stay? Why risk everything for me? You didn't know me. You could have walked away." Daniel stopped beside her car, his hand resting on the window frame, his pale eyes fixed on hers, steady and quiet. For a long moment he didn't answer, the night pressing around them, filled only by the faint hum of both engines. She thought maybe he would leave her question unanswered, the same way he had brushed aside her gratitude before. But then at last his voice came, low, deliberate, carrying the weight of memory. "Because someone once did the same for me." The words were simple, but they sank into her chest like stone into water. She blinked, unsure how to respond, her lips parting without sound. Daniel straightened slightly, the lines of his face catching the truck's headlights behind him. His expression didn't change, but there was a shadow in his eyes, a story he didn't tell, one she sensed had been carved deep into him long ago. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to ask more, to press for details, but something in his tone held her back. It wasn't refusal, it was reverence. Whoever had once stood for him, whoever had given him that chance, it was sacred. To ask more would be to break something fragile. She nodded instead, her eyes wet. "Then I'm glad," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm glad they did." Daniel didn't reply, but the faintest shift in his posture felt like acknowledgement. He tapped the end of his cane lightly against the gravel, then glanced at her hood, checking the sound of the engine as if to remind her that the road still waited. Claire pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling her child move, small and restless. She thought of the night, the fear, the circle of men who had wanted to break her, and she thought of this stranger who had stepped from the shadows to stand in their way. His answer was all she needed. The bond had already been forged, not of obligation, not of chance, but of something older, carried from one act of courage to the next. She eased the car back into gear, pulling slowly onto the road. Daniel followed, his headlights steady in the mirror once again. The night stretched on, but it no longer felt endless. Somewhere between the broken gas station and this quiet stretch of highway, something new had been born, a bond unspoken, unbreakable, carried forward with every mile. The sky was beginning to pale at the edges by the time the car rattled up the final stretch of road. Claire's eyes stung from exhaustion, her body heavy with the weight of 2 days' worth of fear and adrenaline. She leaned forward, gripping the wheel tighter, squinting as a familiar silhouette of her sister's house came into view. The white siding glowed faintly in the dim light, the porch light left on as if in silent hope that she would find her way home. Her chest tightened, tears threatening as relief finally seeped in. After miles of empty highways and a night that had nearly swallowed her whole, she was here. Behind her, Daniel's truck followed as steadily as it had since they left the gas station. Every time her car had coughed, every time she feared it would die again, those headlights had remained a quiet promise that she would not be left stranded. She slowed as the driveway approached, her heart thundering as gravel crunched beneath the tires. The car shuddered as it rolled to a stop. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, whispering a broken thank you to no one in particular. Maybe to God, maybe to the child stirring gently inside her. The front door opened before she could gather herself. Her sister appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a robe, her face pale with worry. She hurried down the steps barefoot, her arms already reaching as Claire pushed open the door and stumbled out. The sisters collided in an embrace that was half sobs, half relief, Claire clinging tightly as though she might dissolve as she let go. Her sister murmured words she could barely hear, promises of safety, of rest, of home. But even in that moment, Claire's eyes flicked over her shoulder to the truck idling at the edge of the drive. Daniel sat behind the wheel for a long moment, watching in silence. Then, as though some unseen signal had passed between them, he killed the engine and stepped out. He didn't come closer. He didn't intrude on the reunion. He simply stood there for a moment, his cane in hand, his gaze steady on the house, as if making sure it was real, as if confirming she was truly safe. Claire pulled back from her sister, wiping tears from her face. She turned toward him, ready to call out, ready to say the words that had been pressing against her chest since the fight. Gratitude, recognition, something to let him know what he had given her. But by the time she opened her mouth, Daniel was already moving. He crossed back to his truck with the same quiet discipline he carried into every moment. His boots crunched on the gravel, his coat shifting faintly in the early light. He climbed into the cab without hesitation, as though leaving was a natural order of things. He had brought her here. His role was done. Claire stepped forward, her hand lifting slightly. "Wait!" The word broke out of her before she could stop it, but the truck door closed with a dull thud, and the engine came to life again. The sound was steady, unhurried. He didn't look back at her, didn't acknowledge the half-formed thanks caught in her throat. The headlights swung across the yard as he turned the wheel, then angled toward the road. Her sister touched her arm gently, guiding her back toward the house. "Who was that?" she asked softly, glancing at the truck as it began to roll away. Claire's lips trembled. She shook her head faintly, eyes fixed on the taillights shrinking into the pale dawn. "Nobody important," she whispered, echoing his words, though her voice broke with the weight of knowing it wasn't true. The truck disappeared down the road, leaving behind only the faint hum of its engine carried on the morning air. Claire stood in the driveway a moment longer, her hand still hovering over her stomach, her heart steadying as she let the presence of her sister's home wrap around her. She was safe now, but the man who had made it possible had chosen to leave without thanks, without recognition, fading back into the road, as if he had only ever been a shadow passing through. Morning light spilled gently across the small town, washing away the long shadows of the night before. The gas station still bore the marks of what had happened. Broken bottles swept to the side, faint streaks of gasoline staining the concrete, tire marks scorched into the gravel. By dawn, the bikers were gone, their retreat complete, but their absence was louder than their engines had ever been. People stepped cautiously out of their homes, curiosity tugging them toward the place where so much noise had rattled through the dark hours. They found fragments of the story in what remained. The glass, the bent metal, the silence of men who once thought themselves untouchable. By noon, whispers were already traveling through town. At the diner, someone said they saw a man standing alone against a circle of outlaws, moving with precision like he'd been trained for it his whole life. At the hardware store, the clerk swore he had heard the engine scatter, retreating into the night like animals turn away from fire. And at the barber shop, an older man shook his head slowly and muttered that it had been years since anyone had dared to make the gang back down. The stories varied in detail, but every version carried the same core. One man had stood against many, and he had not broken. No one seemed to know his name. The cashier at the convenience store admitted he had seen him, though only in fragments between hiding in the back. A boy claimed he glimpsed him through a curtain, describing pale eyes that looked like they had seen more than anyone wanted to imagine. To some, he was a drifter. To others, he was a soldier who had wandered into their town at the exact moment he was needed. The lack of certainty only made the story grow. Claire, safe now in her sister's house miles from that lot, listened as her sibling relayed the whispers filtering in through phone calls and neighbors stopping by. She said little, holding her belly as her child stirred within, the rhythm of tiny kicks grounding her in the reality of survival. She didn't correct the stories, didn't add to them, didn't try to give them shape. She carried the truth inside her, that the man had not fought for glory or recognition, but simply because he could not walk away. As weeks turned into months, the story hardened into local memory. Some retold it with embellishments, adding knives and flames that had never been there. Others stripped it to silence, describing only the steady way he had stood, cane in hand, as engines roared against him. But the essence remained unchanged. When fear ruled the night, someone had refused to bow to it. Years later, when Claire's daughter was old enough to ask about the world she had entered, the story came to her not through gossip, but through her mother's voice. Claire didn't dwell on the violence, didn't describe the broken bottles or the bruises left on the men who had come with cruelty. Instead, she told her daughter about a night when one person's courage held back the darkness. She spoke of a man who had stood between her and danger with nothing but his will and a quiet strength that did not waver. Her daughter would grow up knowing that story, not as a tale of fists and blood, but as a lesson that even in the most fragile moments, someone can choose to stand unshaken. She would hear that her life began not with fear, but with a reminder of resilience, with the echo of a man who had once said he was nobody important, yet proved otherwise when it mattered most. And in that small town, long after the gas station was repaired and the stains faded from the concrete, people still remember the night the outlaws were turned away. They remembered the silence of a Marine veteran who carried his scars like shadows, who fought not for recognition, but for a stranger. His name might never be known, but his presence lingered in every telling. The legacy of that night was not measured in broken chains or bruised faces. It lived in the quiet strength passed from one generation to the next, in a child who would one day understand that her life began under protection of a man who refused to run, a man who had stood unshaken when it mattered most.